Miguel Delaney, good morning to you. How are you getting on?
Good morning. Not too bad.
Um,
Adjusted.
Yeah, there's actually been plenty of sports news and plenty of football news over the last while as football grapples with the crisis. I might talk to you about that in a moment, but the big story over the last week or so has been the progression and the seemingly relentless march to getting the deal done. So Mike Ashley, it looks like, is going to sell to a group which is essentially essentially Saudi Arabia. When it all comes down to it, it's not just a sovereign wealth fund. It is Saudi Arabia as a nation state buying into a team in the Premier League.
Yeah, which is an absolutely remarkable situation. And to be honest, I was surprised they went so direct. I mean, there's a similar project at Manchester City, obviously, that we all know about, Abu Dhabi. And that is where Saudi Arabia also taken their lead, given that Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, obviously, are huge allies, having just conducted a war in Yemen. But even with Manchester City in 2008, and it was a more naive football world, there was more of a kind of degree of separation to it. It was, I mean, they set up this Abu Dhabi United group where Sheikh Mansour could buy the club as a quote unquote private investor, even though everyone knows it's a state operation. They've got some of Mohammed bin, the MBZ, the Crown Prince of UAE or Abu Dhabi, so his key people in the club like Khaldoon, like Simon Pearce. But with this, it was just so much more direct. So it's basically, as you say, the sovereign wealth fund, and sharing that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, or essentially the ruler of absolute power of Saudi Arabia. So it's much more nakedly a state project, which should raise so many more questions. But it's incredible that the Premier League doesn't really have any sort of protection, or even football in general in England doesn't have any protection, so states can't buy clubs. I mean, because that very concept is so absurd and so it poses so many troubling questions that it's actually remarkable it's allowed to happen, and particularly when it's a state like Saudi Arabia. I mean, if you want to draw a direct link like we're talking about here, I mean, yeah, the PIF are going to own 80% of Newcastle. The PIF is chaired by MBS, and just recently, the US Senate passed a resolution holding MBS responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And that's, go before you get to all the various issues about Saudi Arabia's human rights record and what they plan to do at Newcastle.
Before we get to that, right, just explain why you think it is so ludicrous for a nation to buy a football club.
Well, I mean, first of all, it really does come back to what clubs actually are, which is they're community hubs, social institutions that represent their local area. That's what it comes down to, beyond just the playing of sport. And it's from the initial playing of sport, that's what they developed out of. And they have a genuine social value. So they aren't just businesses. And the owners and directors test is there in the first place. Or, well, it used to be the fit and proper persons test. It's there to protect against kind of spivs and old-fashioned businessmen because, again, they aren't just businesses. There is an inherent social value to clubs. And it does feel like the rules haven't updated to reflect the situation. But to go beyond that, to take this thing that actually does have a community value, does mean something to people. And like I did a piece last year on the potential death of the 72, a lot of the lower league clubs due to the kind of the nature of the modern game and all the rest of it. But like talking to people in government over here, a lot of points made, particularly in smaller towns or mid-sized towns, is that the football club is actually the only social hub left, that lots of kind of the police lean on them, lots of local authorities lean on, because it's the only place where people actually, congregate anymore in that way, which, is kind of opens up wider values to all this. But then the idea of a state coming in to use what is one of the few community assets left. And the thing is, I mean, ultimately, in an ideal world, a football club would only exist for the purpose of the football club. Now, that was distorted with kind of all sorts of businesses coming in, and you can look to people like the Glazers, even FSG at Liverpool, who are ultimately in this for pure capitalistic purposes. But when it goes beyond pure money making, because money making should at least feasibly coalesce with making the team better. So there is a certain amount of a marriage of convenience. But with a state, I mean, this is about political ends. I mean, it would be a problem with any state, but ultimately most states don't see the need to sports watch, which is why in football right now, there's currently only two states or emirates that own clubs. That is Abu Dhabi, Manchester City, and Qatar with Paris Saint-Germain. And now we could have Saudi Arabia thrown into that. And, look at the makeup there. This is essentially the ongoing economic Cold War in the Gulf, which has a huge impact on geopolitics, which now has a power base and is directly influencing Premier League football. And that's how did we get to this? It's like, I think you saw last week when it looked like this deal could at least be slowed down because of the broadcasting complaint from beIN Sports, who are a Qatari company, who made the complaint about, Saudi Arabia, obviously, as part of this economic Cold War, have set up this pirate station, BOQ. And so suddenly, Premier League football is just a proxy in this ongoing blockade, this economic conflict between the countries. And it's quite sad when we got to this. And now we're at this situation where it does feel we're just trammeling towards this takeover, which let's not forget is a takeover of one of England's great clubs, although it could be any club. You don't need to add an adjective like great. To take a great club by one of the three most criticised states in the world. I think, we're kind of looking at some of the issues on human rights record or criticism from Amnesty, and the only two countries that seem to get worse at the moment are Myanmar and North Korea, which says it all. And yet, this looks like it's going to happen.
The beIN Sports thing slowed it down. Did it derail it in any way? Was there a way out? Was that some form of protection? Because I can't work out whether or not the Premier League are hands off and don't care, or if the Premier League are like, oh, actually, this is probably a step too far for us. That kind of hasn't come out just yet. And so I wondered if the beIN Sports and the piracy was going to be a blockade on this, which would allow everybody to kind of at least buy some time.
See, the issue for the Premier League, they're ultimately laissez-faire on this. And the Premier League, and this goes back to the breakaway, it's really just a members club. So any kind of change to regulation or any kind of strong move would really require the kind of, first of all, any change to the charter regulations require a majority of the 14 to vote. And in a case like this, where you could say, really there should be some sort of ethics clause where you can't allow countries like this or owners like MBS to own a club. But that would require 14 clubs to vote in favour of that, and most of them would just want to sell to the highest bidder anyway, so they wouldn't want that sort of protection in. As regards to copyright, from talking to people last week, what I heard was when Amnesty and Fair Square were writing letters, they didn't really care about that because they didn't think it would have any sort of effect. They were still confident the deal would go through. The broadcasting issue did cause a bit more wrinkle because it does put the Premier League in a difficult position because, the growth of this league is so inherently connected to its success as a broadcaster, really. And even if you go back, when they were struggling to appoint a new chief executive, the main parameter for the role wasn't any sort of traditional sports background. It was basically someone that had a media history because the main part of that job is negotiating broadcasting contracts internationally. So this does throw a potential issue, but I don't think from what I've heard, not enough, because it's just not watertight enough, not direct enough. And the mood in the Premier League is, unless there's an absolute watertight legal case to prevent this deal, that's not going to happen. That's connected to, I think, the laissez-faire nature of Premier League Premier League regulation that way. And the new chief executive, Richard Masters, we had a press conference with him 2 months ago in which this was actually brought up. And we were talking about the Newcastle situation, really. But he kept putting the hypotheticals of the owners and directors test. So actually, something more than just text to me. Governments should really be stronger in this. There should be some sort of social protection for clubs or sports bodies in that way in general. But of course, obviously, with the UK government, they have their own complications there since they have a strategic alliance with Saudi Arabia. And as Fair Square put it in their letter to the Premier League on Friday, for the UK government, that strategic alliance basically will trump human rights concerns. But can you imagine, would the Premier League be more, would they be as comfortable passing this deal through, or even the situation we're in where it looks like it's going to go through, if it meant at the same time that the Premier League CEO had to be up in front of parliamentarians getting a grilling about the whole, and that's where this breaks down. There is ultimately, it is an institutional problem that this is just allowed pass through.
Yeah, absolutely. Miguel, just one question I have on this is, if this takeover does go through, do we expect the Saudis to have the same sort of extreme change on their club that we've seen at Manchester City, that we've seen at Paris Saint-Germain? Is it almost a situation where they're later to the party, and I guess financial fair play has made a little ripple in the ocean here, but perhaps because of the years of delays that the Saudis have waited to make before actually getting involved with a Premier League club, that actually they may not have as extravagant a change in the fortunes of the football club as City and PSG?
Yeah, well, first of all, financial fair play is definitely an issue there. It will slow them down because, I mean, if you look back to what City are now, so much of that was dependent on the 4 year head start they had before FFP, where from 2008 to 2012, they could pump so much money in. And one of the reasons City so quickly got so big was because, I mean, if you read that book, The Club by Josh Robinson and John Clegg, their strategy was they just go to all their immediate rivals, which in that case was clubs like Aston Villa, Arsenal, and offer so much money for their best players. In one turn, strengthening City and kind of scuttling these clubs directly around them. And it worked and got them very quickly. Newcastle won't be able to do that due to FFP. But also, from everything I've heard, I do think there was a bit of a difference in outlook. For the piece I did last week, I was talking to Iyad al-Baghdadi, who was targeted for assassination by the Saudi state. He was warned of that by the CIA, had to be sequestered safety in Norway. And he's only in Norway because he was kicked out of the UAE for the sentence. And like he's kind of as much of an authority as you can get on these matters. And he did point out to me that he said beyond oil, the Saudis don't have as much of a culture of business professionalization as the UAE do. So he did point to how the UAE, Abu Dhabi very quickly went. And for City, basically, they went and appropriated the brains trust of football. They went and got the apple of football, went to Barcelona and put in Soriano, Biguirson, put in the best possible people they could. He doesn't, from everything he's seen in other businesses, and he said he didn't think the same would be the case with Saudi Arabia. He pointed to an example of Turki Al-Sheikh, who was in some way close to MBS. I can't remember the exact power structure, but he took over clubs in Egypt and it ended up being like a situation with him being abused. At the moment, the talk is that Amanda Staveley will be running the club, who's the financier, who was involved in putting the City deal or in facilitating the City deal in 2008, as you say, and is now her company PCP will own 10% of the deal now. But also, someone else put to me said that the Saudis actually had to be convinced of this a little bit. They're not going into it as kind of full-blooded as Abu Dhabi United Group were in 2008, and they're a bit more lukewarm. So I wouldn't expect the rapid expanse or maybe the total level of project that Manchester City is. So it might, but obviously they'll still look to spend a lot.
Miguel, you're talking about, would the Premier League be more reticent if they felt like they were going to be hauled in before one of those select committees? That we saw obviously it did have an impact on the public's perception on things like British cycling, for example. And the answer is you definitely would be a bit more reluctant to get involved in something if you thought that you were going to be held to account for it. But the Premier League's answer to that will surely be the point you've made about how the British government are essentially partners with strategic partners with Saudi Arabia. Like, I can see how difficult a situation it is for the Premier League, for their architecture as well, to kind of say, well, like, my members here want to be able to sell to the highest bidder, which, by ruling billionaires out and nation states out, will prevent them from making money down the state. And also the government. Like, am I going to be the sports organisation that goes against the government and says, actually, what you're doing on a geopolitical level is wrong? So where is there a way out for anybody in this that is going to allow face to be saved or allow we're actually doing the moral thing? Like, what's the path to this not being allowed to happen, at least in future?
Well, I'm not sure there is one, because, I mean, especially with the fact that this does feel such a line in the sand. For a state like Saudi Arabia to own a football club just feels like the ultimate low, and really the point of no going back. And you could argue we're kind of been traveling in that direction for some time anyway. And it's also why this is such a massive story beyond even the actual takeover itself, because it does reflect where football is going. I mean, the game, and particularly the English game, through kind of initial regulations in the 1980s, through the breakaway to the Premier League, it's probably integrated hyper-capitalism more than any other industry on earth. I mean, I did a piece in this in February, and like David Goldblatt, the football historian, put it to me basically that it's probably more hyper-capitalistic and more an open global market than international banking, which is saying something. And that's, I mean, this situation then is a consequence of that, and also a consequence of the Premier League kind of being so, international, non-judgmental about owners in that sense. And And yeah, this does feel its ultimate consequence, and it doesn't feel like there is a way back. I mean, even connected to the government thing, obviously, at a government level, they just don't want to get involved because of the strategic alliance with Saudi Arabia, even though they could actually probably sidestep that and point to it's about social protection for clubs, even though in this case it would feel so transparently about Saudi Arabia. But then you do get into problems about, okay, it prevents other clubs in the future, and Manchester City are owned at the moment at 77% by Abu Dhabi. So I mean, you could get into these arguments about the Glazers or Abu Dhabi having to give chunks of their clubs. So that's one part. Now, in saying that, it was put to me last week by both a sports lawyer, Kevin Carpenter, and by Nick McGeehan of Fair Square that the regulations of the Premier League at the moment, they would allow for prevention in this deal, but it would require very strict interpretation of regulation. That's the problem, I suppose. They're so open to interpretation, so vague, when there isn't that will there. And at the moment, there's not like government pressure there. But even on a lower level of that, in this case, like I heard a story at the weekend that some concerned groups went to, I better be careful what I say here because it was off the record, like I can't give too much away. They went to basically a usually concerned politician who had been very outspoken about Mike Ashley, about to speak out against this. And they totally washed their hands of it, basically pointed out, there's lots of bad owners. And I suppose the thinking there was they didn't want to go against this deal when they know that there's most of Newcastle basically wants to happen. And there is also the promise of investment in the local area, which again, and this again, it points to the other various strands of this story, where one reason beyond Mike Ashley, beyond the football, where people argue for this takeover is because ultimately people feel that Newcastle is one of those cities that's been neglected by London, neglected by Westminster, and this will be the investment that's badly needed. But at what price?
Yeah, it's the white knight that comes in and you're like, oh, what are the strings that are attached to the white knight? Like, oh, didn't actually look at the fine print. I wanted to ask you a little bit about because I'm pretty sure it was your story originally about the Premier League clubs cocooning their players in hotels and somehow trying to get back to play. It looks like we're getting close to some agreement, at least on the strategy in the background, about how many people would be involved in a match day broadcast, how many people would actually be in the stadium for playing behind closed doors. What's your take on the direction this is going at the moment? Like, how close are we to some programme for return to football sooner rather than later when it comes to Premier League matches and the completion of the season?
I'm quietly optimistic. Maybe that's the wrong word in the circumstances, but I think it will happen by early to mid-June. There's a will there both from football and from government. Government have wavered on that for the past few weeks because of how the situation has gone. And when the death toll in England did get really bad in the past few weeks, they stopped looking at football as an issue at that point. But that has changed a bit in the last 2 weeks. Government have gone back to their original thinking, which was that people need something to restore a bit of normality, and what better than that than the national game in England. But also that they feel football could be one of those components that helps get the economy moving again. But because, I mean, if this happens, and I do think it will, there'll be TV mega events with huge advertising. And there are, of course, bigger debates about this. But if you look at, say, gambling, which is so key to media revenue, I mean, gambling advertising will shoot up, and it will cause a little bit of a circle that helps get things back, gets the economy moving even. And so there is a will there, and that's why in the past 2 weeks as well, the discussions among the actual Premier League teams have ramped up at the same time. And now, kind of, from what I've heard, even players have been told a little bit more about kind of concrete plans about what will be happening, where they'll have to go. It should be kind of 6 weeks sequestered in a hotel. I mean, very strange, but even from the players' perspective, the will is there to get back playing. They're kind of bored of sitting around.
It actually makes sense. It's money for the TV companies, it's money for the players. It kind of guarantees their wages in a way that they wouldn't be guaranteed if this lasted any much longer. And it's going to finish the season. Everybody's committed to finishing the season, is that correct?
Yeah, basically. And everyone sees voiding the season, or even doing what they did in the Netherlands. Actually, the Netherlands did void it as an absolute last resort. And that's not just, I mean, the easy accusation in these situations is always it's down to greed and money, and that's part of it. But there is a genuine issue about the kind of survival of clubs. I mean, for a long time, people have been saying that if there's any sort of delay, we could have up to 4 Premier League clubs going into administration. That it is that high. I mean, everyone looks at the Liverpools and the Spurs because of the issues like going to furlough. But it's only a certain amount of clubs that are insulated, because football is ultimately, it's like the airlines, it's a cash flow business. And as soon as that flow stops, a lot of them are actually in trouble, particularly given how high the wage to turnover ratio is. But it's not just about greed or money or survival. It's also the issue of sporting integrity, in that there is a real quandary within the game about, if it's cancelled, what do they do when they start up again? Is it just basically the 29-20 season restarted? How do you sort issues like sporting integrity, which is one other reason why they just want to get it finished? And again, to restore some sort of normality with football.
That all makes sense. Miguel, great stuff. Thanks a million for joining us this morning. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.